Kamala Harris is on a media blitz with less than a month to go before the U.S. election.
I was the first vice president or president to ever in office go to a reproductive health care clinic, ever.
Really?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
I didn't know that, but I guess that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Was it a mistake to loosen the immigration policies as much as you did?
It's a long-standing problem, and solutions are at hand. And from day one, literally, we have been offering solutions.
Adding to her list of national media appearances today, Harris appeared on ABC's The View and SiriusXM's The Howard Stern Show. Later tonight, she'll be on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. The media blitz comes after Harris has largely avoided interviews since replacing President Joe Biden at the top of the Democratic ticket. So what is it doing for her campaign now? Aaron Blake is a senior political reporter at The Washington Post. Alana Shore is a senior Washington editor at Semaphore, and they both join me now. It's good to see you both. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks, David.
Thanks.
So, Aaron Blake, I'm old enough to remember all these columns and editorials about Kamala Harris avoiding the media, and look at her now. What do you make of this push in the final month of the campaign?
Yeah, and a lot of her defenders arguing that this was a manufactured issue and that she didn't actually need to do this, that it was helpful for her to avoid these kinds of unscripted moments. I think it's clear that it took them a while to become comfortable with putting her out there like this. Early in the race, especially, she was gaining without doing these things. It was kind of a gathering storm of momentum that came irrespective of the things that she said in these unscripted interviews. She was doing rallies and really exciting people. I think this is a recognition of a new moment in this campaign where these kinds of interviews are not only part of the job application that she has to do to become president. You know, she couldn't kind of go throughout this entire campaign without doing these interviews. Combined with a recognition of the idea that this can be helpful for her, getting out there to these audiences without having to buy ad time. If you trust your candidate to do those things, going on things like 60 Minutes, going on podcasts that have high listenership with key demographics is something that they're focusing on right now. Those can be helpful to you as long as you believe that you can handle these things. And that seems to be at least a shift or maybe a late shift in how the Harris campaign is viewing this race.
Right. So Alana, let's just talk about the podcast, because I did something this week I didn't expect to do. I followed and downloaded an episode of Call Her Daddy. I'm not the demographic for Alex Cooper's wildly popular, I'm told, podcast, but this is where the vice president went. I mean, what do you make of this move by her to do this? Because this is going to reach a whole different demographic than, say, 60 Minutes or Aaron's Campaign Moment podcast, for example.
Well, that's a really good point. And I would liken it, frankly, to what Trump did by appearing on Theo Vaughn's podcast. I don't know if your listeners have heard of Theo Vaughn or your viewers, but he and Alex Cooper are kind of the same 20-something, early 30-something type of whisperer. And this was savvy by Harris because, she's not looking to court that many of the disaffected young men who might be listening to Vaughn, but she is looking to court Cooper's viewership, which tends to skew, again, younger, female, super interested in reproductive rights, which, Harris clearly, correctly sees as an advantage over Trump in the polling. So, I'm curious to hear what you thought, but I think a lot of people, especially in the national media, who have found Harris a little bit buttoned up and kind of uncertain in a 60 Minutes type setting, found that interview kind of humanized her in a way that might really help.
Yeah, there's an interesting moment because it's not just to reach young women, Alana, it's to mobilize them, right? Because the Democrats have seen success when they're mobilized around these issues. But there's this moment in that podcast when Alex Cooper says her mom was a psychologist and Kamala Harris goes, "Oh, how was that?" It's just a very sort of like normal moment that, Aaron, you're not going to see on 60 Minutes. You're also not going to see Donald Trump on 60 Minutes, right? Like there's some criticism the podcast was easy on Kamala Harris. 60 Minutes isn't easy. What do you make of her performance there and Trump's decision not to do it?
Yeah, I think it's obvious that the 60 Minutes interview was a tougher format for her, and that's to be expected. This isn't an audience that is necessarily and an interviewer that's necessarily on her side. And there were a lot of moments in this interview where she was really pressed. When she didn't directly answer the question, Bill Whitaker, the CBS News journalist, would press her on that, and she kind of would talk around the question again. So I think that really kind of cast a spotlight on some of these areas in her campaign that aren't exactly buttoned down and she hasn't really addressed. So I think that kind of gets at maybe what the Harris campaign was a little bit more concerned about. We forget Kamala Harris is now a relatively popular presidential candidate. But as far back as a couple months ago, she was a very unpopular vice president. What people saw of her, they didn't necessarily like when they weren't being fed advertisements and she wasn't really front and center in their lives. And so there is a really big question about how she can handle the scrutiny, how she can handle these kinds of tough questions. And I think 60 Minutes is really the first instance of her submitting to somebody who's a really substantial journalist in a long form setting.
So, Alana, she may not have nailed every question, but she sat down and she did it, unlike Donald Trump, who had agreed to it. And then if you watched 60 Minutes up front, they said he backed out because he didn't want us to fact check and he wanted us to apologize for our 2020 interview. And all. How do you think the former president's decision not to sit down with 60 Minutes is being viewed?
I mean, there's how it's being viewed by his base and frankly, even undecided voters. And there's how it's viewed by, the media and the Washington class, right? I mean, Trump has never been the kind of person who invites these moments. So in a sense, I think to people who know him well, it's not surprising that he would duck out. Keep in mind, he also talked about doing more debates, but very few people expect him to follow through on that. Harris kind of trounced him, right? So, but then let's look at Trump's base and potentially even undecided voters. Is 60 Minutes and ducking that going to significantly swing people away from him right now? Unfortunately, probably not, despite, our correct sense that exposing yourself to media scrutiny is important for candidates. It's probably not going to move that many people.
Yeah, I'm curious to see if there's a bunch of op-eds about Donald Trump not doing interviews, just to sort of balance it out, right? But I wonder, Alana, we also saw on Howard Stern today, Harris went after Trump for this big story in the new Bob Woodward book that Trump as many as 7 private phone calls with Vladimir Putin since leaving office, sent him COVID-19 tests back in 2020. He has responded, calling Bob Woodward a bunch of names and questioning his mental faculties right now. But what do you make of this allegation and what it might mean?
Well, this, frankly, is potentially more likely to move some voters, right? Because if there's one thing like your average low information American voter might know about Donald Trump is like he said some pretty awkward, weird things about Putin in the past, right? So it's not a great look, no. And you see Harris, frankly, correctly, from a political perspective, jumping on this pretty fast, as she did on Stern.
Aaron, what's your thoughts on that? I mean, he calls the whole Russia thing a hoax, and then we have a revelation like this, and going after Bob Woodward's sources is that's a play because of his track record. I mean, how do you think this can move votes at this stage of the campaign?
I mean, Donald Trump has been saying and doing awkward things with regard to Putin for a very long time. There was, of course, the time when he was president where they broke off and had a private meeting, and there was really no record of what was said at that meeting. I think if there's one thing in this report that might stick a little bit, it is when it is reported by Bob Woodward that while Trump was sending this medical equipment over to Russia for Vladimir Putin to use, which, by the way, sounds like kind of a no-no to begin with, Putin responded to him and said, you really shouldn't tell people about this. And Trump didn't seem to understand that. And Putin said, well, the reason is because I think it would hurt you. I think that gets at the real symbiosis that exists between these two men. And that kind of contributes to this Democratic talking point that Trump is really aligned with these kinds of authoritarians and maybe doesn't have the interests of a country like Ukraine in his heart.
Yeah, with friends like Vlad, who needs enemies, right? So, Alana, overlaying the political campaign are these back-to-back disasters caused by Hurricane Helene and potentially Hurricane Milton. But there's also this enormous backlash over deliberate misinformation being spread on the relief efforts and FEMA's response and the amount of aid that's out there and budgets being dried up for migrants. How does that affect things? Because it hits a particular part of the electorate that maybe wants to hear that kind of narrative. How is this playing out in the campaign?
I mean, frankly, it's a good question. We don't have a lot of solid data on that yet. What we do have is, Republicans from Glenn Jacobs, the libertarian mayor of Knoxville, Tennessee, all the way up to Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina saying, hey, cut it out with this misinformation. FEMA is not doing the things that a lot of commentators online are alleging that they're doing and trying to cool some heads. So, this isn't the first time, though, that a lot of folks in Trump's MAGA base have sort of peddled some incorrect talking points online, and establishment Republicans have tried to stop it from spreading, and it hasn't really succeeded. So it will be really interesting to watch, to what extent this false claim about FEMA and what federal authorities are doing on the ground actually affects voters.
Aaron, do we have a sense of whether this misinformation is affecting the actual relief efforts? Because, I mean, the election is one thing, but people are in a crisis situation and have an urgent need for support. Is it affecting the actual operations in the disaster zone, or is it just social media ecosystem to target low-information voters?
I mean, if you ask some of these local Republican officials that Alana mentioned, Glenn Jacobs, the Knox County, Tennessee mayor, the congressman from Western North Carolina, Chuck Edwards, a state senator from the area named Kevin Corbin, who spoke out on this earlier to combat this misinformation. They basically said that these theories about FEMA somehow blocking or confiscating supplies, which have been spread by both Elon Musk and Donald Trump, they said that this was damaging to the relief effort because people were not trusting of the people that were there to help them. And so when you have these people in these areas, I thought this was a really significant moment in this, because it's one thing to spread misinformation about what's taking place and to kind of put something out there on social media and ask people to believe it in a way that helps you politically. It's another to do that about a tense situation like this and to have your own allies step forward and say, this kind of thing is not just false, but it's actually something that is working against us and hurting the relief effort. And so we haven't seen a lot of Republicans step forward since then to offer similar criticisms of their fellow Republicans. But this is something that they have registered as being unhelpful. And it is something that is coming from the highest levels of the Republican Party and the conservative movement.
It's remarkable. I remember in the early days of Twitter, in a difficult situation, you went there for urgent breaking news. And now, with the dark MAGA phase of its new owner, that's not what it's doing in these joint crises that we're seeing play out. Aaron Blake with the Washington Post and Alana Shore with Semaphore. It was good to have you both here today. Thanks for your time.